There comes a moment in a woman's life when what she built with patience, with discipline, with the quiet courage of holding it together, begins to fracture, not because she failed, but because the old architecture was never meant to carry the full weight of who she is becoming. The world calls it collapse. The psyche calls it initiation. It arrives without ceremony, a door that does not open, a message that never comes, an absence where reassurance used to live. And suddenly, the ground beneath her feels less like earth and more like thin glass, the kind that shatters under the simple act of standing. In that kind of silence, the mind reaches outward like a hand, searching for a rail in the dark. It wants proof. It wants a sign that the waiting has meaning. It wants a witness. Yet the most disorienting feature of this threshold is precisely the disappearance of witnesses. The mirrors go blank. Applause fades. The familiar feedback loops approval, recognition, the small confirmations that say, keep going. You're doing it right, fall away one by one until there is only breath, pulse, and the raw sound of one's own inner life. The world can feel indifferent then, as if the universe has turned its face elsewhere. But from a Jungian lens, this is not abandonment. This is the psyche withdrawing external scaffolding so the inner structure can finally be built. The modern feminine is often trained into a particular kind of endurance, perform strength, remain desirable, stay useful, keep the peace, be inspiring but not too much, capable but never threatening, over time. This creates a self that functions beautifully in daylight, a personality polished enough to survive expectations. Jung would call much of this the persona, the mask that negotiates belonging. The persona is not a lie, it is a survival art. But when a woman's soul begins to demand more truth than performance can provide, the persona starts to crack. And when it cracks, the world may interpret it as instability. The inner world interprets it as honesty. This is why the final test so often feels like devastation. Devastation is not merely loss, it is revelation. It strips away what was held together by external confirmation and exposes what can stand without it. When validation disappears, the psyche becomes a barren landscape, a desert where old strategies fail, pleasing, striving, explaining, proving. There is no one left to persuade, no audience to convince, no timeline to bargain with. What remains is an encounter with essence terrifying, intimate, and uncompromising. Jung understood that the descent into darkness is not a moral punishment, but a psychological necessity. The soul does not crown itself without first meeting what it has avoided. In myth, the heroine does not become sovereign by collecting trophies. She becomes sovereign by crossing the underworld and returning with her own truth intact. This is the archetypal pattern beneath the personal pain. The psyche moves toward wholeness, and wholeness requires integration. Integration requires the shadow. The shadow, in Jung's sense, is not only cruelty or weakness or taboo. It is everything a person cannot yet own. For many women, power itself is shadowed ambition, radiance, appetite, authority, pleasure, even rest, somewhere, often early. The nervous system learned that shining creates risk, envy, rejection, punishment, loneliness. So the psyche makes a bargain. It chooses hunger over visibility. It chooses almost arriving over fully arriving. It keeps success at a safe distance where it can be fantasized but not inhabited. Then, the universe looks like it is withholding, when in truth, the inner world is still negotiating safety. The final test begins when that bargain stops working. The familiar hunger becomes unbearable, not because desire is wrong, but because it has been used as a substitute for self-belonging. The psyche asks a sharper question now. Can longing exist without self-erasure? Can desire be held without desperation? Can a woman want greatly and still remain seated in her own worth, rather than pleading at the gates of her own future? In the beginning of this threshold, the silence feels like a void, returning nothing. Prayers seem to vanish into the air and fall back as nothing but breath. but in the psychological language of initiation, silence is not absence, it is pressure. It is the sacred pause where the old identity dissolves. It is the interval between the mask and the face, between the life that was tolerated and the life that will be chosen. A woman standing here may feel as though she is losing time, losing momentum, losing herself. Yet something else is happening beneath the surface, something quieter than panic, but stronger, like a seed underground, surrounded by soil and stone. There is no evidence of spring, no proof of blossoms, only the dark and still. The seed continues, not because it knows the outcome, but because continuation is its nature. The feminine psyche, when it remembers itself, carries the same instinct, not the brittle optimism that demands guarantees, but the deeper capacity to remain alive inside uncertainty. This is where empowerment begins to shift from idea to embodiment, not as confidence performed for the world, but as emotional sovereignty practiced in private, the ability to remain faithful to the self when the outer world offers no confirmation, the ability to stand in the desert and not beg the mirage to become water, the ability to say, without spectacle, without bargaining, without collapse. The silence is not proof of unworthiness. The silence is the proving ground where worth becomes unshakable. As the silence stretches, time itself begins to feel unreliable. The psyche notices this before the mind can name it. Days blur, milestones dissolve, and the future loses its familiar shape. This is not accidental. One of the first illusions to be dismantled at this stage of transformation is the belief that growth obeys a schedule. The feminine psyche, when pressed toward individuation, is asked to release her contract with when. Relief no longer arrives on demand. Breakthrough no longer responds to effort. Even hope, when tied to deadlines, begins to feel brittle. What remains is a more unsettling invitation to be whole without reassurance that anything will change. Jung described this tension as the holding of opposites, a psychological posture that feels unbearable to the ego, yet essential to maturity. Desire must remain alive without mutating into grasping. Surrender must be present without collapsing into resignation. Many falter here because the psyche prefers extremes. It swings toward frantic control planning, manifesting, visualizing harder, or retreats into numb detachment, pretending not to care as a form of self-protection. Neither state is faith. Both are fear wearing different costumes. The narrow bridge between them is where transformation quietly takes place. Loss often escorts a woman to this bridge. A role ends, a relationship dissolves, a dream that once organized identity loses its power. From the outside, it looks like misfortune. From the inside, it is exposure, when the structures that once held meaning fall away. The psyche reveals what was never truly owned. If selfhood was built on achievement, recognition, or being chosen, loss feels like annihilation. But if something deeper has been slowly forming beneath the surface, something prior to approval and untouched by rejection, then loss becomes a strange kind of liberation. The false self collapses so the essential self can breathe. Jung observed a particular suffering in those who remain perpetually close to realization, yet never cross the threshold. Myth gives this pattern a name: Tantalus. Reaching endlessly for nourishment that recedes at the moment of contact, psychologically. This appears as a life organized around almost successful, almost loved, almost free. The psyche learns to survive in proximity rather than possession. Hunger becomes familiar. Fulfillment becomes frightening. And so, at the final moment, something sabotages an avoidable mistake, a retreat into safety, a choice that preserves the known discomfort over the unknown expansion. This is not bad luck. It is protection. The psyche guards against a terror more profound than deprivation. The terror of actually having what one desires and being required to become large enough to hold it. Abundance demands responsibility. Visibility demands integrity. Love demands presence. for a woman who has learned that shrinking ensures safety. The idea of fullness can feel like exposure. Better to remain hungry. Hunger has rules. Hunger has borders. Hunger allows longing without accountability. Here, the shadow reveals itself not as darkness, but as disowned light. Power hidden, joy withheld, authority unclaimed, the psyche learned, often early, that wanting makes one vulnerable, that receiving invites scrutiny, that shining attracts harm. So the brilliance is buried, the desire remains, but it circles itself, never landing. The universe appears to withhold. Yet from a Jungian perspective, the withholding is internal. The soul knows that until the inner structure can sustain the weight of fulfillment, arrival would fracture rather than free. This is why the so-called test feels so precise. The universe does not respond to performance. It does not reward spiritual theater or emotional self-denial masquerading as surrender. It responds to truth, and truth has a texture that cannot be imitated. A woman may say she has released attachment, but if her nervous system still trembles with desperation, the psyche has not yet integrated safety. She may say she no longer cares, but if numbness has replaced aliveness, desire has simply gone underground. Neither state signals readiness. Readiness appears differently. It arrives as a quiet steadiness, a desire held without apology and without demand, a longing that does not negotiate self-worth, a capacity to say, "This is wanted," but it is not required for wholeness. Jung called this active surrender not passivity, not withdrawal, but alignment. The recognition that the role of the ego is not to force outcomes, but to become congruent with what seeks expression through it. At this stage, the psyche begins to reorganize itself around an internal axis rather than external confirmation. Emotional sovereignty replaces approval-seeking. Clarity replaces striving. The woman no longer vibrates as someone reaching from lack, but as someone standing in presence. The shift is subtle and often invisible to others. There is no announcement, no moment of triumph, just a gradual cessation of desperation, a release of the habit of scanning the horizon, a settling into the body, into the now. This is not detachment born of bitterness. It is not the pretense of indifference. It is the return of choice, the ability to remain open without collapsing, the ability to want without self-betrayal, the ability to stand in uncertainty without demanding that it resolve immediately. This is the inner climate the universe recognizes not as a test passed through effort, but as a state embodied through integration. As this internal climate stabilizes, a deeper dismantling begins. The psyche turns its attention away from outcomes and toward identity itself. Jung referred to this phase as a symbolic death, the necessary dissolution of the self that was constructed to survive rather than to live. What unravels here is not competence or intelligence, but the subtle belief that worth must be earned, that belonging must be negotiated, that safety depends on adaptation. The structures built around comparison, achievement, and self-monitoring lose their authority. They no longer organize meaning, and in their absence, a woman may feel suspended between worlds, no longer who she was, not yet who she is becoming. This in-between space is often mistaken for emptiness. In truth, it is saturated with potential. It is the womb of transformation, though it rarely feels nurturing. The psyche strips away familiar reference points, roles, timelines, even the sense of direction. This is why so many turn back here. The unknown can feel like annihilation to the part of the self that equates control with survival. Returning to the old identity, even if it causes pain, can seem preferable to standing unarmored in possibility. Jung named this stage the nigredo, the blackening. The first movement of alchemical change. It is characterized by confusion, loss of form, and the feeling that life itself has gone dark. Yet this darkness is not random. It is precise. It dissolves what cannot accompany the soul forward, the false self constructed from expectation, adaptation, and fear must die so the essential self can emerge. This death is not metaphorical to the psyche, it feels real. Grief accompanies it. So does loneliness, not the loneliness of rejection, but the sacred loneliness of individuation. No one can walk this passage for another. Support may exist, but rescue cannot. This is the solitude where a woman meets herself without witnesses, without performance, without distortion. Here, the shadow steps forward fully not only the disowned wounds, but the disowned capacities, the anger that protects boundaries, the authority that claims space, the joy that refuses to be minimized. Integration begins when these elements are neither indulged nor suppressed, but welcomed into consciousness. The psyche moves toward wholeness not by choosing light over dark, but by holding both without fragmentation. During this phase, the universe may appear silent, even withholding. Doors close, paths dissolve, guidance arrives indirectly, if at all. But Jung understood that the psyche has its own intelligence and its own timing. It does not operate according to ambition or social calendars. It moves in spirals, returning again and again to the same themes, each time at a deeper level of awareness. Forcing resolution before integration is complete creates crisis. Surrendering to the rhythm allows transformation to unfold organically. This surrender requires humility, not the humility of self-erasure, but the humility of acknowledging limited perspective. The conscious mind does not always know what serves growth. What is desired may be misaligned with what is needed. What looks like delay may be protection. What feels like rejection may be redirection. The psyche invites a radical trust here. Trust not in outcomes, but in process. Trust that the inner intelligence guiding transformation is more accurate than fear's predictions. There is a crucial distinction at this point between resignation and conscious surrender. Resignation collapses inward, carrying bitterness and defeat. Conscious surrender opens outward, carrying curiosity and presence. One closes possibility, the other creates space for it. A woman anchored in conscious surrender does not abandon desire. She releases the demand that it arrive in a specific form or time frame. She allows the future to remain unwritten while fully inhabiting the present. As this posture stabilizes, something subtle shifts. The nervous system softens. The constant vigilance eases. Life is no longer approached as a problem to solve, but as an experience to meet. The psyche stops rehearsing escape routes. Stillness becomes accessible, not the stillness of stagnation, but the stillness of grounded presence. The woman discovers that she can remain intact even when certainty is absent. Her sense of self no longer fluctuates with external conditions. This is the threshold where solitude transforms from punishment into sanctuary, where the absence of approval reveals that self-recognition has been quietly forming all along. The psyche learns that it can generate its own coherence, its own meaning, its own sense of home. External validation loses its addictive pull because it is no longer required for stability. What once felt like emptiness reveals itself as spaciousness. Here, the universe begins to speak again, not in grand signs, but in subtle alignments. Synchronicities emerge, encounters feel timely, inner knowing sharpens. But these communications can only be perceived because desperation has quieted. The psyche has developed the sensitivity to listen. The woman no longer demands guidance in neon lights. She notices the quiet language beneath ordinary moments. And in doing so, she realizes that the silence was never empty. It was preparatory. As the psyche settles into this deeper listening, the relationship with desire itself begins to transform. Wanting no longer feels like a wound demanding immediate relief. It becomes an expression of aliveness rather than a measure of lack. Jung understood this shift as a movement away from compensation and toward alignment. When desire is used to fill an inner void, it carries urgency, anxiety, and fragility. But when desire arises from fullness, it carries clarity, patience, and strength. The same longing exists, yet it vibrates differently. It no longer pleads, it no longer bargains. It simply states its truth and remains rooted in self-respect. This is where many spiritual narratives become misleading. They encourage detachment without integration, teaching withdrawal as virtue while leaving fear untouched. The ego learns the language of surrender and uses it as camouflage, mimicking release while quietly clinging to control. But the psyche cannot be deceived, nor can the universe. If one accepts that the universe mirrors inner states rather than spoken intentions, truth is somatic. It is carried in the nervous system, the breath, the choices made when no one is watching. A woman at this stage learns to be honest about her hunger without making it a liability. She does not shame her desire, nor does she allow it to dictate her worth. She holds it lightly, as one would hold a bird, firm enough to keep it present, gentle enough not to crush its wings. This balance is rare because it requires emotional maturity rather than technique. It requires the ability to remain present with uncertainty without outsourcing stability to the future. Jung framed this capacity as individuation, the process of becoming who one truly is by removing everything one is not. Individuation is not self-improvement, it is self-reclamation. It does not add layers, it burns them away. The fire of this process consumes borrowed beliefs, inherited fears, and adaptive identities that once ensured survival, but now restrict vitality. What remains after the burning is not perfection, but coherence. A self no longer split against itself, the universe. In this framing, withholds not as punishment but as precision. It does not deliver abundance to an inflated ego because an inflated ego would be destroyed by it. Success sought to prove worth becomes poison. Love sought to heal unintegrated wounds becomes dependency. Visibility sought to escape invisibility becomes exposure without protection. The psyche must be ready to receive without losing itself. And readiness is not confidence, it is wholeness. Jung's concept of the self illuminates this threshold. The self is not the personality or the ego. It is the totality of the psyche, the organizing center that exists beyond conditioning. When life is lived from the ego alone, abundance feels external and precarious. When life is lived from the self, abundance becomes a byproduct of alignment. One stops chasing and begins magnetizing, not through effort, but through congruence. To reach this center, the woman must allow the final attachment to dissolve, the attachment to who she thought she needed to be, the achiever, the caretaker, the good girl, the resilient one, the one who never asks too much. These identities were not mistakes, they were necessary, but they are not permanent. The psyche asks for their release not to erase the past, but to make room for presence, to sit in the void between identities long enough to realize that the void is not empty. It is alive with possibility. This is where many retreat. The absence of form can feel like free fall. Without the old story, there is no script. Without the old defenses, vulnerability is unavoidable. And yet, this is the moment of deepest empowerment, to remain here without guarantees, without proof, without a map is to trust life at a level beyond belief. Jung recognized this as the completion of the nigredo, the end of dissolution, and the beginning of reconstitution. Gradually, without fanfare, something turns, not externally at first, but internally. The woman notices she's no longer waiting, no longer scanning, no longer negotiating her peace with hypothetical futures. She is present, rooted, available to life as it is. Desire still exists, but it no longer destabilizes. Vision remains, but it no longer dictates worth. Hope survives, but it is no longer conditional. This is the invisible turning point. The final test is passed not when the external world delivers reward, but when the inner world no longer requires it to feel complete. The paradox follows naturally. When lack dissolves internally, abundance can approach without resistance, not as a miracle, but as resonance. The psyche, no longer fragmented, can hold what arrives. And yet, even here, life does not become effortless. Storms still come, doubt still visits, fear still flickers. But beneath these movements, there is a foundation that does not crack, a knowing that does not require evidence, a trust that does not collapse when conditions shift. This is what it means to be unshakable, not immune to feeling, but anchored in essence. What emerges on the other side of this passage is not a different life so much as a different orientation toward life. The struggles do not vanish, but they no longer define identity. The storms arrive, as they always do, yet they meet a self built on bedrock rather than sand. Jung understood this stability not as rigidity, but as integration, the psyche, no longer split between who it pretends to be and who it actually is, can bend without breaking. Fear may arise, but it does not rule. Doubt may speak, but it does not dismantle the center. This unshakable quality is often misunderstood. It does not mean the absence of pain or uncertainty. It means that beneath the fluctuations of emotion and circumstance, there is a constant sense of inner legitimacy. A woman no longer needs permission to exist as she is. Her worth is no longer a negotiation. Her peace is no longer conditional. She has crossed the threshold where self-abandonment is no longer an option, even under pressure. From this place, external abundance may or may not arrive in recognizable forms. Success may come, love may deepen, opportunities may appear, but these are no longer the proof of transformation. They are simply expressions of an inner state that has already shifted. Jung would say the psyche has recentered itself around the self rather than the ego. Life begins to organize differently, not because it is being forced, but because it is no longer being resisted. This is why the universe often seems to move only after the internal shift is complete, not because it was waiting to judge worthiness, but because the psyche had not yet become a stable container. Abundance given too early fractures the unprepared self. Love offered before integration becomes dependency. Visibility granted before self-trust becomes exposure. The delay was not punishment, it was refinement. At this stage, the woman understands something fundamental. She was never being tested for goodness, effort, or endurance. She was being invited to remember her inherent belonging. The final test was not about proving devotion to the universe, but about embodying devotion to her own truth. The universe did not need convincing. It was watching to see if she would stop betraying herself for approval, stop abandoning her instincts for acceptance, stop shrinking her presence to make others comfortable. When that betrayal ends, something profound settles into place. The hunger that once drove her becomes guidance rather than ache. The waiting that once felt unbearable becomes patience. The silence that once felt cruel reveals itself as sacred preparation. She sees now that every closed door was shaping discernment, every delay was strengthening sovereignty, every unanswered prayer was stripping away illusion. Jung believed that when individuation is honored, suffering transforms into meaning. The psyche no longer needs to teach through collapse because it has learned through integration. Life still challenges, but the lessons no longer feel punitive. They feel purposeful. The woman meets them not as a fragmented self-seeking rescue, but as a whole being capable of response. This is the true reward on the other side of the final test. Not applause, not validation, not even certainty. The reward is coherence, the ability to stand alone without feeling abandoned, the ability to be with others without losing oneself, the ability to desire without desperation, to love without erasure, to move forward without betraying the present. In this state, time is experienced differently. There is less urgency, less comparison, less fixation on arrival. The future is approached with openness rather than demand. The present is no longer a waiting room. It is the place where life actually happens. Presence becomes the portal, not as a technique, but as a way of being. The gap between who she is and who she thinks she should be closes, not because circumstances change, but because resistance dissolves. The universe, in Jungian terms, is not a separate force bestowing rewards. It is the mirror of inner alignment. It responds not to words or wishes, but to embodiment, when trust is claimed somatically, when worth is lived rather than argued for, when peace is non-negotiable. The mirror reflects that coherence back as opportunity, connection, and flow. And perhaps the most paradoxical realization arrives quietly. The test was never about earning anything. It was about allowing oneself to be whole without waiting for permission, allowing life to meet that wholeness without interference, allowing the old story to die so something truer could live. The woman recognizes now that she passed the moment she stopped searching for exits and began inhabiting where she stood. She passed when faith became independent of outcomes, when peace became internal, when essence was no longer for sale. The universe did not suddenly change. She did, and now it can meet her without distortion. This is not the end of the journey, but it is the end of fragmentation. From here, life unfolds not as a test to survive, but as an expression to inhabit. The silence was never empty. It was the pause before coherence. The darkness was never a tomb. It was fertile ground. And the music that follows is not something external arriving at last. It is the sound of a life finally aligned with itself. If these reflections resonated, consider supporting this work by liking the video, sharing it with someone who may need it, subscribing for future explorations, and leaving a comment about what part spoke most deeply. Reflection shared becomes reflection multiplied.